Hey guys, I've come here. Many of you asked about it, so here's the first tutorial to my art style, which maybe is not the most breathtaking one, but it may come in handy to illustrate and describe concept arts like custom Brawl Stars skins. This video will cover the art part. Let me know if you would like to know about my process for getting skin ideas. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to this channel and join me on Discord to see my live streams and follow me on other socials to get a preview of all my skins. The links are all in the description. But let's start, shall we? Okay, so the first thing you should do is to find a good pose for your skin idea. I usually use Pinterest and look up for drawing pose references or similar queries, maybe with a keyword that describes a personality trait or an action that I want to emphasize. In some cases, you may want to search for chibi pose references. In fact, some brawlers more than others feature chibi proportions, and it may be difficult to translate a normal size pose into chibi. Once you find a good reference, you can either paste it on your canvas or just look at it from a different screen. I usually prefer to just look at it to avoid being too influenced by it, but in some cases poses may be very challenging and having them right behind your drawing may help. Of course, if you are very familiar with human anatomy or are doing a simple pose, you may skip this part. Okay, so you are ready to go to start your drawing. As for the drawing software, lately I've been using Procreate on iPad, but this process can be done in other apps as well. If it's available for you, I suggest to use Procreate, or else Sketchbook is a good cheap alternative for Windows users with a graphic tablet. The first sketch I make is usually to outline the pose I chose and to get to know better the character I'm drawing. As you can see here, before drawing the custom skin, I sketched the brawler himself. As for the brushes, just use the brush you are most comfortable with for sketching, even though try not to make too thick lines which may be difficult to trace later. When making the pose, take care of the surrounding. In this case, you can see how I'm trying to give some depth by placing one element on the foreground. I also suggest you to add something in the background, but you may do it after finishing the main drawing. As a rule of thumb, keep in mind the general composition so that it looks harmonical. If the pose looks unbalanced, think of adding elements in the foreground or the background to fix it. Come back on your drawing many times and adjust it to get more and more similar to the skin you have in mind. You can also work on a different layer for the second part. Once you have most details of the skins on the canvas, it's time to get to the outline. So first about the brush. When I use the Adobe Fresco, I always use vector monoline brushes, but here in Procreate and in most drawing apps they are not available. As an alternative, you can look for a monoline pixel brush, usually under the calligraphy category. This brush is easier than others to use because you don't have to pay attention to the pen pressure. So for the outline, use a thicker line, while you can use a thinner line for the inner lines. Let's say between half and 1/3 of the outline. This moment may be useful to further refine your skin and to add some details. Once you're done with the outline, duplicate the outline layer and start coloring the bottom one. When possible, pick the colors from original brawlers. At Supercell, they pay attention to keep consistency among different brawlers and skins, so for example in this case that I'm drawing a superhero themed skin, it's better to rely on their palette rather than doing one on my own. Same goes for the skin tone, of course, even though you may have to tweak it a bit. So the first step of coloring is just filling all the areas of the drawing. Sometimes it happens that the color scheme just doesn't look as good as you thought it would. In those cases, don't be afraid to just start back until you figure out a good harmony of colors. Once you finish this part and you are satisfied with the results, it's time to work on the shading. Before shading, try to imagine where the main light source could be. About the shading style, it may be an oversimplification, but let's say there are two main paths: 2D shading and 3D shading. I usually prefer the former, but many other artists do 3D shading instead. Here's my Manta Beer, one of the few skins I did with 3D shading. Of course, it gives a more natural look to the drawing, but I still prefer the overall result of 2D. It's up to you, you can choose either of the styles. For 2D shading, you can keep using the monoline brush and fill tool, while for the 3D shading, you should opt for soft airbrushes. Okay, so let's make a new level for the shadows. Give it a low opacity and set it on multiply. If you want to give your skin a more natural light, consider picking a very dark blue and a very light yellow instead of black and white for shadows and lights. This is usually done to mimic the way sunlight behaves. When you get to lights, set instead the level on Add, again with a low opacity. So at last, consider adding some background elements, or eventually some details to give more dynamism to your pose. Here you can see I'm adding a trail of energy drink behind Dynamax. Use the same process used for the rest of the drawing, but be sure that the background enhances the skin without being protagonist. Don't add too many colors or details, and pick a palette that brings out the skin, for example using complementary colors. Same goes for the overall background color. You can never go wrong with white, but a good color can bring out your character even more. At the end, you can add some white reflections to make everything shining or to give the idea of movement, as in this case I did with the energy drink. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this first tutorial. Please let me know if you want me to talk more about some specific aspects that I didn't cover. Remember to join me on Discord for a new contest and think of supporting me and my art on Patreon. See you in the next video and stay tuned for the next Brawl Factory productions.